Hey everyone. So we're going to have a really simple video today. We're just going to talk about what the sort of speech order, time, structure of a debate looks like, so that you can know what your job is going to be when you get to the debate. So this is sort of hard to picture without looking at a demo debate. So I really strongly suggest you either watch a demo debate before this or after this so that you can see how this goes. Um, we're just going to go through every speech and sort of think about what's supposed to be done, who's doing it, and how to have this debate. And before we go through that, I guess I should say the reason we have a structure to debate is so that people know when they're supposed to speak and they can say what they want to say without being interrupted, and they can get their ideas out there for the judge to hear and for the other team to be ready to respond. Because, in real life and debate, you just sort of say something and then someone will maybe cut you off and they want to say something, and it's very chaotic, and you don't really get deeply into the arguments like you would want to. So in debate, we have a structure so that we can have really in-depth, meaningful arguments, and a judge can listen to the reasoning of both sides and come to a result that makes sense for them. So in every debate, there are 8 speeches. 4 of them are called constructives and 4 of them are called rebuttals. And there's also 4 cross-examination periods. So those are the main things we're going to talk about today. When you are in your debate, you're going to give 2 speeches. You're going to give 1 constructive and 1 rebuttal. And you're also going to answer questions during 1 cross-examination, and you're going to ask questions during 1 examination. So you're going to do basically everything. And if that worries you, you're like, oh, how am I going to fill all this time? How am I going to be ready? How am I going to, that's okay. Both teams get 5 minutes of preparation time each. So you and your partner have 5 minutes, and then the other team has 5 minutes. And you can spend it before any speech or before any cross-examination so that you make sure you have time to figure out what you want to say, how you're going to say it, and what evidence you're going to use. So when we talk today, I'm going to suggest some places where it makes sense to use preparation time, and you can see if that makes sense for you, okay? You'll also have a sheet that says all of these when you go to your debate, and your judge will also have this. So don't worry if you don't memorize it all ahead of time. You don't have to. You're gonna have it when you're in your actual debate. So don't worry about it. Okay. The first speech is the first affirmative constructive, sometimes called the 1AC. It is a maximum of 4 minutes long. So you can spend less time than 4 minutes if you want, but you shouldn't spend more than 4 minutes doing this. And if you go to 4 minutes, the judge will cut you off and ask you to, wrap it up, finish your sentence. The person who gives this speech is the first affirmative debater. So on the affirmative team, there's usually 2 debaters. There's the first affirmative debater, and then there's the second affirmative debater. So the first affirmative debater gives the first affirmative speech. Makes sense. The goal of this speech is for the 1AC to present the main arguments and story of the affirmative. So you should have your 1AC all put together already. What evidence you want to use, how you want to say it, what your main story is, what your goal is, what your plan text is. You should have that all set up ahead of time. That's what you get to do in practice, is you figure out what you want to say and you set it up, right? So can new arguments be brought up in this speech? Yes, and they have to be, right? Because this is the first speech where we put the main arguments out there. And can new evidence be brought up in the speech? Yep, you absolutely can read new evidence. You can talk about new evidence in this speech. Okay, after those 4 minutes, when the first affirmative constructive is done, then we have cross-examination time. And this is 2 minutes long. So in this first cross-examination, the second negative debater number 2, whoever that is on your team, the 2N, they're going to ask questions of the first affirmative debater. So a first affirmative debater just got done. Now the 2N, the second negative, is going to ask them questions. And basically the goal here is for the negative to ask questions of the affirmative that show flaws in the affirmative plan, or show logical inconsistencies, or it helps set up negative arguments. So let's say you're the negative and you want to be able to say that the affirmative plan is going to cost too much. It's going to cost too much, and then you know, we're going to have to take that away from education or healthcare or whatever. It's going to be bad. Okay. So maybe you want to ask some questions about like, how much would this plan cost to pass? Where does the money come from? What have other things been done like this before? And how much did those cost? Things like that. So can new arguments be brought up in this speech? Things like advantages, off case, etc. No, because arguments aren't presented during cross-examination. So you can ask the other team about the arguments they made. You can ask them what they meant by it or clarify it, but you can't bring up your own new arguments, right? You can help set up arguments, like the thing with the money. You can ask them about money and spending, but you shouldn't be saying like, you know, my first question is, wouldn't this plan cost a lot of money and also make it have to take money from healthcare and education? That's not a very good question, right? Because what you're really doing there is you're just stating what your argument is. So you want to ask questions of the other team that lead you where you want to be so that you can make new arguments or make the arguments you want to make in your next speech. And can new evidence be brought up? No, because evidence is not read or presented during cross-examination. So you could ask the other team about what their evidence is or what it says, but you can't stand up in cross-ex and like read a piece of evidence and then be like, oh, what do you think about that, affirmative team? Like that's not cross-examination. That's just making an argument and asking a question. So cross-examination is the time where you ask questions of the other team, or if you're being asked questions, you answer them. Okay, after that cross-examination, we have the first negative constructive, which is 4 minutes long. And this is done by the first negative debater, the 1N. So you'll notice in the cross-examination before this, we had the second negative debater do the questions. And now in the first negative speech, it's the first negative debater who's giving the speech. So during that cross-examination period, where the 2N is asking questions of the affirmative, if you're the first negative speaker, you shouldn't really be asking questions or involved in the cross-examination. You should be getting ready for your first negative speech, right? Let your partner ask questions, let them do their job, and you get ready for your speech so that you can make sure it's as good as it can be. And since you have this cross-examination time to prepare your speech, you shouldn't be using preparation time, right? The 1NC is something you should have planned out. You should have it figured out before you even go into the debate. The only thing you might need to figure out is which advantage did the affirmative read? So I need to figure out what evidence I'm going to read versus each advantage, right? Okay, and the goal of this speech of the 1N is to respond to the main arguments of the affirmative and bring up main arguments of the negative that weren't brought up in the affirmative. So let's say you're a novice debater and you want to talk about the disadvantage, and obviously the affirmative hasn't talked about the disadvantage yet because that's not part of their main argument. So this is the speech where you should bring up things like disadvantage, counterplan, critique, depending on what level you're at. If you're a rookie, you don't need to worry about that. You just respond to the arguments that the affirmative made. But if you're a novice, JV, or varsity, this is where you bring up your new arguments. So can new main arguments like advantages, off case, etc., be brought up in this speech? Yeah, absolutely. This is where the negative should bring up their main arguments. And sometimes the main argument is not that the case is bad or that's wrong. It's that it might produce some other effect that is worse than solving the problems that they do, right? So you can bring up new arguments here. And can you bring up new evidence? Yes, absolutely, and you should. The 1NC should be a lot of evidence reading where you read your best pieces of evidence to make your arguments, and you don't really have to do a lot of explanation. The evidence should speak for itself. Okay, now we have another cross-examination period. It's 2 minutes long. In this cross-examination period, the first affirmative debater is going to ask questions of the first negative debater. So the first negative debater just made the speech, and now the first affirmative debater is going to ask them questions. And I don't know if you've noticed this already. If you did, you're very sharp. The next speech is from the second affirmative debater, right? So during this cross-examination period, the first affirmative debater is asking questions in cross-examination, while the second affirmative debater is preparing for their speech that's coming next. So if you're the second affirmative debater, you already get 2 minutes of cross-examination time where you should be preparing your speech. You shouldn't be asking or answering questions during this cross-examination period. You should get your speech ready. And that way, if you're getting your speech ready for these 2 minutes, you shouldn't have to use very much preparation time to make sure you have the right answers for your speech, right? Okay, so the goal of this cross-examination period is just like the other one. You want to show flaws in the opponent's arguments. You want to set up your own arguments. You shouldn't be reading any new arguments here, right? You don't read arguments here. You just ask about the arguments other people made, and you don't read evidence in cross-examination. So you don't need to worry about that either. You just stand up, ask questions of the other team. Okay, now we get to the second affirmative constructive, sometimes called the 2AC. It's 4 minutes long. It's given by the second affirmative debater. If you're the second affirmative debater, this is the first time you get to actually do something during the debate. So here you go. It's your time to shine. And what's the goal of the speech? What does the speech do? The goal of the speech is to respond to the negative's main arguments and defend and extend the affirmative's main arguments. So if they attacked your plan, if they attacked your case, you have to figure out how they attacked you or where they attacked you, and then respond to that. And then, make sure you tell the judge the story of what your case is now. So let's say, oh, they attacked our solvency. They said we can't solve the problem, but we actually can. Here's 2 pieces of evidence saying how we can, how it's important. But they didn't attack our uniqueness or impact. So they agree with us, like uniqueness is true, impact is true. This debate is just a question of whether we solve this problem or not. Okay, so you need to break down for your judge what's going on in the debate here, and then read evidence to help explain to them why you are winning the debate right now. So can new main arguments be brought up in this speech? This is the only complicated question here, is technically yes. Technically this is a constructive, so you theoretically could bring up new arguments. Like let's say you read one advantage in the 1AC, and now you want to extend that advantage and read the second advantage. Technically, you could do that. This is a constructive, but it's generally frowned upon. It's seen as, bad behavior because the negative doesn't get that much time to respond to any new arguments. So you should probably stick to the arguments you made in the 1AC and stick to responding to what they made in the 1NC. That doesn't mean you can't bring up answers to their arguments. So like if they read a disadvantage, you should definitely read answers to the disadvantage. That's not considered new because they brought up that argument already. But if you want to bring up something completely different that nobody's talked about this entire debate, technically you could do that, but you probably shouldn't. Judges don't like that. Other teams don't like that. It just makes things messy. And, if it's really that strong of an argument, you should bring it up in the 1AC. Get out right away. Can new evidence be brought up in this speech? Yes, absolutely. You should be reading evidence in this speech. The 1AC is like 100% evidence that you're reading. In this speech, it should probably be more like 70 or 80% evidence you're reading. So you want to read evidence and then explain a little bit about why you're reading it, what it means, but focus is more on just like presenting evidence, presenting facts, presenting authors who really know a lot about the subject and what they have to say about it. Okay, after that is cross-examination, just like the other ones. The second affirmative debater is questioned by the first negative debater, and the goal is to show flaws with the affirmative's arguments. New arguments are not brought up, and evidence is not read, just like before. And you'll notice in this cross-examination, after this cross-examination, is the second negative constructive. So once again, the first negative speaker should be asking the questions in cross-examination. Second negative speaker should be getting their speech ready. They shouldn't be doing cross-examination type stuff. Let them do their thing. Okay, and then in the next speech is the second negative constructive, which is 4 minutes long. The second negative debater, the 2N, gives this speech. The main goal of this speech is to respond to the affirmative's main arguments from the 2AC and defend and extend the negative's main arguments. Can you bring up new arguments in this speech? Again, technically, yes. Like if you wanted to read a new disadvantage or a new counterplan or a new critique, technically you could, but you really shouldn't. And I'm going to strongly tell you really shouldn't here. Judges are going to see this as cheating. They're going to see it as bad sportsmanship. They're going to see it as just sort of a dirty, underhanded thing to do, right? And the reason that is because the affirmative only gets 2 speeches after this, and they're only 2 minutes long. So they're not going to have that much time to respond to this. And the negative has had a lot of opportunity to bring up new arguments at this point, and they should have done it by now. So if you're waiting this late to do it, it's seen as unsportsmanlike and seen as being a really weak argument to bring up something new, completely new in this speech. Now, that being said, let's say you want to attack the affirmatives plan and you already attacked the uniqueness, but now you want to attack the solvency and you haven't talked about the solvency yet. It's totally okay to bring that up, right? Because you're talking about the affirmative case, which has existed since the 1AC. So it's okay to add something new onto something like that, but to bring up something totally new, like a new disadvantage, new counterplan, new critique, don't do that. Not a good call. Can you read new evidence in the speech? Yes, absolutely. This is where you want to take some of the main arguments from the affirmative and answer them with some really good negative arguments. So you want to read new evidence here. Next up is cross-examination. It's the second affirmative debater asking questions of the second negative debater. And again, you just want to show flaws, point out reasoning problems, and set up your arguments as the affirmative. Shouldn't be any new arguments in this, and shouldn't be any evidence read in this. Okay, next speech. You might have guessed it would be the first affirmative speaking, right? But it's not. It's actually the first negative rebuttal. So this speech is given by the first negative debater. It's only 2 minutes long, 2 minutes, because it's a rebuttal. And the goal is to respond to the affirmative's main arguments from the 2AC and defend and extend negative's main arguments through the negative side's arguments, right? So you'll notice that's exactly the same goal as there is for the second negative constructive. Why? The reason is because the negative gets these two speeches in a row, and it's called the block, the negative block. So what you should be doing here is both partners should be deciding who should be answering what arguments. You don't want to answer the same things, right? Because there's no affirmative speech in between these two negative speeches. They don't have a chance to respond. So if you and your partner as the negative both answer the same arguments in the same way, you're literally just repeating yourselves. So don't do that. As the negative, you should have a plan ahead of time about who's going to talk about what. So let's say you're a rookie and you're on the negative team, right? And in the 1NC, you make arguments about the affirmative's solvency and impact arguments. Maybe in the 2NC and the 1NR, you want to split that up. Maybe in the 2NC, you want to talk more in depth about solvency, and maybe you want to talk about uniqueness a little bit too. And then in the 1NR, maybe you want to talk about the impact more in depth, so that you're talking about two completely separate argument lines, and that way you're not stepping over each other. If you're novice, junior varsity, or varsity, generally what you want to do in the block is to split it up so that one of you will take the case arguments, the arguments about the plan, and then the other one will take the off-case arguments, like the disadvantage, counter plan, or critique. So that way you have a really solid split between who's making what arguments, and it can be really clear to the judge that they're two different things. Can you bring up new arguments in this speech? No, absolutely not. You only have 2 minutes to make your argument already. You don't want to crunch your time and have to bring up a bunch of new stuff along with that. And also, you shouldn't really be bringing up any new evidence in the 1NR, in the first negative rebuttal, unless the affirmative brought up a bunch of new arguments in the 2AC. So if you can't bring up new arguments and you can't read new evidence, what are you even supposed to do in a rebuttal? That's a question that I hear a lot. So this is where the debate starts getting away from reading evidence and gets more towards actually explaining it. So if you've watched the impact weighing video or any of the other videos about, what arguments are in the evidence, this is where you start, telling the story to your judge more clearly. So you can tell them things like, our opponents argue that doing the plan will solve this problem because X, Y, and Z. But we've read 2 pieces of evidence saying that they won't be able to solve this problem because there are these other issues involved or these other reasons why they can't solve this problem. Therefore, judge, if our arguments are true, then they can't solve the problem. And if they can't solve the problem, you can't vote for them because the plan doesn't do anything, right? So, and then you want to get more in depth about the examples and arguments in your evidence and explain how those examples and arguments relate to the story you're telling and the story the affirmative is telling. So that's really what good debaters should be doing is they look at the evidence, they look at the arguments, and then they explain how that relates to the story of the affirmative, which is why the story of the affirmative is the affirmative arguing why the judge should pass the plan, or the story of the negative arguing why the judge shouldn't pass the plan. How does the evidence actually support your argument in doing that? That's what you do in the rebuttals. Okay, after the first, and I think you should take prep time before the second negative constructive because you want to make sure your second negative constructive is good to go. And also the first negative rebuttal happens after the second negative constructive. So if you take prep time before the second negative constructive, basically both negative debaters get to have prep time for their speech. And since there's cross-examination before the first negative rebuttal, as the first negative rebuttal giver, you have the 2 minutes of cross-ex before this, plus the 4 minutes of the negative constructive before this, plus 2 minutes of cross-examination before this. You have 8 minutes to prepare your speech. So you should never take prep time for the first negative rebuttal. It should almost never happen, right? Okay, first affirmative rebuttal, it's 2 minutes long. This is where you respond to the main arguments of the negative and extend your main arguments as the affirmative. This is, you only have 2 minutes in the speech to respond to basically 6 minutes from the negative. So instead of trying to make entirely new arguments, you should be looking at the arguments that already work for you and already make sense and trying to explain them to the judge and show how they make your story really strong. So like this box says, you can't just try to win every single argument on the flow in the debate. You're gonna have to choose which ones are your strongest arguments, which ones are gonna help you win the debate, and then tell the judge, we're winning the solvency. We have 3 pieces of evidence. They make 7 different claims. Those claims are all strong because they say blah, 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 right? So we know we 100% solved this problem. So if you vote affirmative, there's 7 different ways to solve the problem we outlined. So vote affirmative, right? It's as simple as that. It's just being able to say, here's our story. Here's the facts that support our story. Here's the opponent's story. Here's why the facts don't support their story. Vote for us. And you have 2 minutes to explain your best arguments and explain your best reasons why that's true. Can you bring up new arguments in the 1AR? No. Can you bring up new evidence in the 1AR? No. You should have everything you need already to be able to do this. The only thing you're adding in this rebuttal is more storytelling, more context, and more comparison for the judge so that they can understand how your arguments all fit together and why they're stronger than your opponent's arguments. Okay, second negative rebuttal. This is the last negative speech, the last negative rebuttal. So this is where you really want to hammer, and you have 2 minutes. This is where you really want to hammer home what the story of the negative is. You want to choose your best arguments and tell the best version of your story. So let's say you're a varsity debater and you're really fast and you've read answers to the case, you've read the disadvantage, and you've read the critique. You could argue, you could try to go for all those things in your last speech in 2 minutes, but I can guarantee you there's no way you can do that in a way that's going to be persuasive to a judge. So you should probably just pick and choose what your best arguments are. Let's say it's some answers to solvency on the case and then the disadvantage. And that way you can say, listen, the affirmative doesn't solve the problem that they say they solve. It doesn't do anything good. And also, they're going to cause this disadvantage that's going to cause a bunch of harms to a lot of people, and it's going to happen relatively quickly. So therefore, it's a bad idea to pass the affirmative because it has no benefits and a lot of harms. Vote negative. That's all you do, right? You look at your arguments, you look at what the evidence is for your arguments, and you choose what, all these things together, all this evidence together. What story does it tell? How am I going to explain this to the judge in a way that's going to make them want to vote for my team at the end of the debate? Okay, then we have the second affirmative rebuttal, 2 minutes long. It's the same thing, but on the opposite side. You're the affirmative, you look at your case, you say, what's the best story I can tell with this case? Like maybe you win all your arguments on the affirmative and you're like, yep, there's a problem right now. Our plan solves it 100%, and it would make everyone's lives better. It would rock, it'd be awesome. Okay, great, easy story to tell. Let's say you're the affirmative and you get to the second affirmative rebuttal and you're losing on solvency. You can still say something like, you know, there's a problem that exists in the world. And it's a really bad problem and it affects everyone a lot. And it's a really terrible thing. So even if you don't think we solve 100% of the problem, it doesn't matter. You're still going to vote affirmative at the end of the debate because we at least have a chance of solving a problem that's really bad. And as a judge, you should want to solve this really bad problem as your first priority. So even if you're losing arguments, even if your story has changed throughout the debate, that's okay. You don't have to read new evidence here. You don't have to bring up new arguments here. You just look at the arguments that exist and you use them to tell a story to your judge about what will happen if they vote for you or if they don't vote for you. And you should have a strong reason why they should vote for you at the end of the debate, right? Why your story makes sense. So that's the end of the debate. The judge will tell you which team they voted for based on what arguments, and hopefully they'll find your story more persuasive. If you're going through this structure and you're thinking about your argument choice, I think you're going to have a really good shot at winning the debate, or at least telling a story that makes a lot of sense based on the facts to your judge. The one last thing to clean up is we have these 5 minutes of prep time, right? So I've made some suggestions throughout this about where you should use this prep time. First, I think you should never use it before the first affirmative constructive, the first negative constructive. Those should pretty much be good to go before the debate even starts. I also think you should never use prep time before a cross-examination period. You should have questions written down well in advance about anything they could potentially talk about. And even if you don't have them written down, it doesn't really matter that much because cross-examination is mostly there to just clarify what's going on and help set up your arguments. So it shouldn't be that hard to just sort of like ask questions off the cuff and figure out what you need to ask, right? You shouldn't need that much preparation time. I think it's okay to take prep time before the second affirmative constructive, just to make sure you have all the right answers together. But that being said, there's only so many arguments that the negative can make in the first negative constructive. So you really should be ready to answer most everything they say. It shouldn't take you that much time to get ready for the 2AC. And in most cases, unless it's like your very first debate or your first tournament, you can probably get the 2AC ready in the cross-examination before it. Same thing is true of the second negative constructive. You probably shouldn't need that much prep time for it. I do think it's a good time to take prep time so that you can talk with your partner and figure out how you want to split the block, figure out who's going to take which arguments, and then make sure you have those arguments ready. So I would probably take maybe a minute, maybe 2 minutes here in most debates if I was the negative team. You should never take prep time before the first negative rebuttal because you have all this time ahead of you where cross-examination's happening, and your partner is speaking their speech, and then another cross-examination's happening. You have like 6 or 8 minutes to figure out what you're going to say in your speech. First affirmative rebuttal, I would always take prep time before the first affirmative rebuttal. This is probably the most important speech in the debate because this is where you have to answer 6 minutes of arguments with 2 minutes of your own arguments. So you need some time to look at your arguments, figure out what your best arguments are, what are your best examples, what's your best data, and get ready to present that and tell that story to your judge. And it does take time to do that well. So take time for your first affirmative rebuttal. Take at least 2 minutes, I think, to figure it out. Even if you feel like you're winning the debate by miles, you're just totally crushing it, you're doing a great job, you and your partner are like awesome and you make so much sense, great, good for you. Still take 2 minutes before the first affirmative rebuttal to make sure you have everything in order, make sure you're not missing anything. Okay, second negative rebuttal. You should take all your prep time, all your remaining prep time before you get here. So whether that's 30 seconds or whether it's the whole 5 minutes, you should take whatever time you have to get ready here. And you should make sure you have your best arguments, make sure you have them in order, make sure you can tell your story, and give the best second negative rebuttal that you can. If you have extra time, you don't know what to do, start thinking about, if you were the affirmative, if you're the second affirmative rebuttal, what would you say at the end of this debate? How would you try to win this debate? And then get ready for what they're going to say and make sure you give the best speech you can give for your side. Last speech is the second affirmative rebuttal. If you're the affirmative and you have prep time, you should take as much prep time as you can. this is your last chance to convince the judge that the plan is a good idea. So you need to make sure you give the absolute best argument you can give. And the only way to do that is to make sure you take enough time to really read over the arguments, really look at your evidence, and present your best arguments, your best story to the judge. So that's everything for the structure of the debate and what to do in the speeches. I hope that this makes a lot of sense for you. I know this is a little bit long, but hopefully this will make it really clear about what you're supposed to do in each debate. And remember, this video series is how to be the best debater possible. It's not about, what to do your first time. So if you get confused, if you forget what part of the debate you're in, if you feel like you don't do your job perfectly in your debate, in your speech, don't worry about it. This is all a learning process, right? So hopefully by the end of debate, by the time you're done with debate, hopefully as an 8th grader or a 12th grader, you're going to be perfect at this. You're going to be awesome at this. It's going to be second nature to you. But in the meantime, if you're just learning this, remember, it's like anything else. You can't expect to be perfect at this right at the beginning. You just keep trying, you keep doing it, keep getting better every time. And before you know it, this is going to be super easy, super obvious to you. It's going to be no problem. So if you have any questions, make sure you talk to your coach. If you have deeper questions that you're not sure how to answer, feel free to post them in the chat. I'll probably get to them eventually. But otherwise, enjoy your time, get ready for your debates, and good luck.